Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good. Can you hear us?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Good to see both of you.
Yeah, here's Penny too. Yeah, a couple of your friends. Who knows?
Yeah. It's been a long time, Skater.
Yeah, it was great. I didn't tell the group, but I remember taking you to the top of Slate Peak there, the highest earth point you ever been. Yeah, at the time. At the top.
Yeah. I've got some great photos of us up there together. Okay, so I was going to do an initial bit of a presentation about RetroSuburbia strategies focusing on water, and then you've got it there.
Yeah, I read the book, and I'm curious, David. As far as I know, it's the thickest permaculture book yet, though. The one from East Timor is pretty darn thick too, but that's 3 volumes.
Yeah. So how should we proceed from here? I've got a bit of a presentation I was going to talk to with a bit of focus on water, and then more on the fire side, bushfire, and we could do questions in between times, or would
well, one topic's fresh, maybe to a few questions, then switch over to the bushfire.
Yep.
And do you have a PowerPoint or anything like that, or you just talk?
Yeah, I'll just see if I can share this. This is a presentation I've done in various forms about RetroSuburbia, and pulled out a few things sort of more focusing on dryland suburbia, but just sort of keeping in mind that RetroSuburbia was very much crafted in a context where I'd lived and worked in the southeast of the Australian continent, in the sort of more cool-tempered and higher rainfall areas. And so we crafted all the examples around that world with the hope that people would adopt but also adapt those patterns outside of that. So we dabbled into a little bit towards drylands and a little bit towards the Australian subtropical east coast. But, you know, from a North American perspective, it's a very much an Australian book. And so within that, there's some things that I didn't emphasise so much because they're very normal in Australia, like rainwater collection, for example. Whereas other things, other strategies that are not so common, I put a lot more emphasis on. Or things like wood energy, because in the modern Australian environmental paradigm, often wood is seen as a primitive, polluting form of energy that we need to move away from, whereas I've always been a strong sort of advocate of wood energy. So we call that chapter The Other Solar Revolution. Now, of course, in parts of North America, wood is much more established as a accepted form of energy. So some of those things will vary greatly. Okay, so let me see.
So David, there is a lot of places in the rural areas, wood is still accepted, but they're more and more in the U.S. trying to make it illegal to burn wood for fuel in more places now.
Yeah, so similar pattern to what's happening here. So this aerial view of an urban food garden in Ballarat that has its own website was actually a brilliant example of what we thought RetroSuburbia was about. You know, a modest house and intensive food gardens and backyard and household home economy. And I think it sort of encapsulates some of the things about RetroSuburbia being a pattern language for retrofitting the built, the biological and the behavioural fields of suburban households, and that all being governed and empowered by permaculture ethics and design principles. So, of course, this framework of principles informs RetroSuburbia, but we haven't highlighted that sort of permaculture engine behind it so much, because we're sort of really trying to get to people who might come to these things through other frameworks or other ways of viewing things. And this notion of the three fields of retrofitting household action is really a simplification of the 7 petals of the permaculture flower, these 7 domains that a lot of people have found empowering in understanding the diversity of things that need to be adapted and changed for a sustainable and just society. But, you know, we simplify these into the biological, the built, which is building and tools and technology, and then all of these other domains, education and culture, health and spiritual well-being, finance and economics, land tenure and community governance. At the household scale, we can say, not just because of the alliteration of a B word, but behavioural, sort of summarises the things that need to be transformed and changed. And of course, that, you know, from Sue Dennett's point of view, she'd say, the behavioural stuff is where it's really at. Whereas people come to this through different frameworks. Some of the tech people and, you know, focusing on the built elements, some of the gardeners and raisers of animals, and, you know, the food production is the key thing. So in the book, we set the scene with, you know, a focus on, firstly, why retrofitting. Most of the buildings and the spaces that in which we'll face very different futures, and those futures, of course, are unfolding in front of our eyes most dramatically over the last couple of years. Most of those places have already been built and will have to be retrofitted to suit radically changing conditions. We're not going to, and we haven't had the capacity to wave the magic wand and say, oh, we will rebuild some sort of sustainable cities or settlements or eco-villages. You know, the time has passed for that. You know, we're in the crisis now. But retrofitting has enormous advantages because it can work through a live-learning cycle where there's less dependence on regulatory approval or bank finance. So this incremental adapt and adopt and copy, and a pattern language of design solutions to recurring dilemmas and tensions helps create harmonious and functional habitats. So I imagined that the bursting of the property bubble could see an explosion of retrofitting and adaptive behaviours for more home-based living in larger shared households. In fact, the pandemic has really been one of the stimulants to that. So Suburbia, because that's where most people live and have grown up in countries like the US and Australia. And it also represents a sweet point where there's a lot of resources, both biological and built, and yet there's enough critical mass to recreate walkable community and economic and social interaction. Of course, that may require changes in the larger economy to really sort of stimulate that potential. Okay, so also in the early part of the book, we have this decision-making matrix for RetroSuburban downshifters. And this is really, this matrix is generated by a tension between the imperative to consolidate with opportunity or necessity to migrate. So that's on the horizontal axis. Do we hunker down where we are, where we know, where we've got connections, or do we move to somewhere that we think is better or away from bad things that are going on? The other tension is between whether we develop and control a personal, household and communal space in a way that suits ourselves and emerging conditions, or the imperative to sort of downshift and disown property and or assets. So that then creates these four spaces. This first one over here we call mobile minimalism, to maintain options, and you can see the little tiny house on wheels. You know, it might be something that a lot of young people sort of take on board. And this is sort of more visionary, where people organise and maybe buy a piece of, an existing property. It might be rural, but it might be buying a big house and retrofitting it together and creating that communal capacity. And over here is the sort of the classic RetroSuburban solution of a family home, possibly consolidating an extended family coming back together. And this, for anyone who hasn't seen it, the Australian comedy film, you could say, The Castle, this family castle for a secure home base is a reference to that light-hearted film. And then the last one, the adapt in situ to age with grace, is a classic response for older people. So to some extent, these strategies might represent things that suit different stages of life, but they also create a complementary ecosystem, because the young people in this mobile minimalism might be the people who come and help these people, through woofing and volunteering over here at the family castle. And this communal living group may have the capacity to look after, isolated older people in their community who need support and help. So this just is a framework that, helps decision making, and might have a chance to come back to that to look at the different patterns of ownership and living arrangements that reflect those four strategic responses of how to live well now while building resilience for challenging futures. Okay, one of the other things that's in the book is, of course, my Aussie Street story, which is really a permaculture soap opera in 4 acts, from the suburbs, Australian suburb of the 1950s, from 1955, that's actually the year I was born, into a near future scenario in 2025. And it's a story I've been telling for a decade, now written down as a chapter in the book. And you can also see it online, me presenting, done many of these presentations around Australia, supported by local government and to audiences of from 30 to 300. And it's also the basis of my critique of what I consider the cult of urban densification that pervades academia, think tanks, government, big business, and even the environment movement. But we need to fill in the suburbs, fill in all the backyard gardens with more higher density houses. So in that, we have a sort of actual meta-analysis of the story, and sort of shows how the behavioural changes actually produce the positive social and environmental outcomes without the need to get rid of all the food-producing space. And that's now been passed into a kid's storybook version called Our Street that we've just released. Okay, so as I said, the main part of the book focuses in the built, the biological and the behavioural. And I love this yurt in a backyard in Melbourne suburbs. You can see the yurt there with this lean-to kitchen, which is a lean-to on the neighbour's shed, which is actually, there's the boundary line where they took down the fence, and here's the gateway into another backyard. A very inspiring RetroSuburbia project that we came across late in the research for the book, a place called Hibby Farm. Well, Hibby Farm is a house just over in the next street, but this is a sort of a cluster of people doing these sort of things close together. And this photo, which I took at Rosemary Morrow's place in the Blue Mountains near Sydney, in a sort of a cool, damp climate like where we live, and her retrofit of the back yard garage that was accessible from a back lane, and she's retrofitted into a passive solar studio. And you can see the big water tank here collecting water off the roof and pumped from the other house and then overflowing into this pond, which has this beautiful reuse of the iconic Australian Hills Hoist rotary clothesline to reduce the risk of kiddies coming along and wandering into the pond and drowning. So very interesting sort of example of retrofit design. But there's collecting water off the roof, collecting it in water tanks and overflow into ponds is also part of a bushfire resilient strategy in what are really quite fire-prone residential areas. So I wanted to focus a little bit on one of the tools within RetroSuburbia, the real estate checklist that is really allowing people to provide a score for their own house or a place that they're considering buying, or looking at really identifying what are the strengths and weaknesses. Because often people get overwhelmed with the diversity of issues that they should consider, and or they get single-minded about either saying, the place I live is really good, it's always been good, it'll be fine in the future. So a sort of a naive, sunny optimism about what's coming. Or alternatively, there's nothing I can do here. There's no point in doing anything. I need to go to somewhere much better. And sort of balance that and say, okay, let's look at all the factors. Now, of course, these factors are in that local bioregional context, and you can see some of the case study properties at the top. Our own Meliodora, which is not strictly a retrofit, Ecoburbia, Abdullah House, the Plummery, and the Share House, which are the main case studies in RetroSuburbia. And all of those are summed at the bottom, and here's the biological field patterns here. We didn't do a scoring for the behavioural because we feel that's not inherent to the property, it's more in the people themselves. So this is also a downloadable spreadsheet from the RetroSuburbia website that people can use it in that more form, more convenient form to sort of get a sort of a better picture of the strengths and weaknesses of a particular property. Okay, so want to come to this issue of water harvesting and storage, which is obviously really important in dryland situations. And most, of course, suburban houses are supplied by town water, mains water, and in the Australian context, and I imagine increasingly in the US, there is restrictions on that water as those systems come under more stresses. There also can be unreliability of those supplies at critical times, such as wildfire, or the potential for breakdown in the reliability of those systems if the authorities which are maintaining them are actually not having the money that they've had in the past. To balance that idea, the idea of collecting water and storing it is got some downsides because water is so damn cheap. Even in Australia, water delivered to people's properties is somewhere between $1 and $4 per kilolitre. Now, a kilolitre is a tonne of water, literally. Now, what can you have delivered, to your property in a truck? Low-grade crushed rock in this country costs about $50 or $60 a tonne. Water is incredibly cheap. So when we focus on collecting water, we focus at first on the high value of drinkable water on the property, which is the most important thing. And of course, that doesn't require very big tanks or very big roofs. And it doesn't necessarily require it at pressure. It can often be by just gravity feed to a third tap in a kitchen sink or just to an outside tap. It means, there is some water there. And then the next level of use in a lot of places is, can the house run on water, or can rainwater tanks be used to at least supplement or maintain some small part of food production systems? And obviously all of this depends on climate, the area of roof that's available to collect water, and how much can be invested both in dollar terms but in terms of space in some sort of storage. Now, because of the complexities of all these interacting factors, in Australia, because we have this culture of rainwater tanks deep in our history and massive revival of it in recent decades, there is software that enables householders to better make these decisions. So this tankulator calculating tool is a great resource that might, be able to be usefully adapted, because you can plug in your rainfall and roof area and do various scenarios with that. So, again, in RetroSuburbia, we didn't go into all of this in great depth because it's actually standard available stuff in this country, whereas I know in a lot of other countries this is sort of new. So much to the extent that, permaculture taken to some countries, if you said permaculture is about growing trees and vegetables and having animals all mixed together, a lot of people in different parts of the world would say, well, that's what just all peasant farmers in our area have always done. What's new about that? But if you came and said permaculture is about catching water in earth dams and in water tanks off roofs, people would say, wow, how does that work? Whereas in Australia, if you said to ordinary rural people, especially, permaculture was about catching water in dams and tanks, they'd say, so what? Everyone's always done that. So in different parts of the world, permaculture will be sort of introducing innovations that have worked in other places, as well as just adopting sensible traditional things from that particular region. Now, in terms of ideas coming back the other way to us from North America, this design is an adaptation from Brad Lancaster and other people's work of, gee, can you get the water that's flowing down the hard surfaces of the street to come into the property and irrigate at least trees on the nature strip or the verge? And, of course, these are ideas that we've put in RetroSuburbia that may not actually be legal, and that it may be important for people to get the social license from neighbours before they do these things, more importantly than asking the local authorities whether it's okay to do this. And I actually showed this in a presentation to stormwater engineers, because a lot of these adaptations come about because people actually just try them and do them. And we've found in Australia, for example, verge gardening, just making food gardens on that strip of public land in front of people's properties, came about because people just did it without permission. And then as more people did it, councils in most places eventually developed guidelines for it, while of course some tried to destroy such things. So we've had cases of both. So this little design, obviously, in the season of excess water flow, it's possible to remove the sandbag and just let the stormwater go to its normal flow paths, which in a winter rainfall area might be in the winter, and maybe even trees are dormant. In a more arid climate, you might be actually catching those occasional winter flows to recharge groundwater. So there's obviously a relationship to soil profile, drainage, the sort of tree systems and everything to, make use of this. And I love Brenna Quinlan's little drawing of the kids playing in the rain when it's happening. A great thing where people actually learn how water works in their landscape by getting out in it and playing in it. Okay. Okay, in terms of the biological field, we really see this idea of garden farming, this small-scale intensive production systems directly associated with houses and providing primarily for household needs, of course, is like a core idea in permaculture. And I prefer to use this term garden farming, especially in a context of seeing permaculture as a more holistic framework than just, food production at this scale, and to distinguish from urban farming, which I reserve for things like community gardens and small commercial intensive food systems that are either within urban areas or immediate peri-urban areas. Because this intimate relationship between the house and the garden, between the residents, that's possible in a permaculture zoning sense when you've got, as Mollison used to say, start at the back door, has huge potential for efficiency, for just-in-time interventions, for, as I'm doing, sitting at the desk here talking to you, I can look out and see things in the garden that might need to be done. Okay, and the garden farming potential of Suburbia I see is very special, because if we look at food growing in terms of order of magnitude of area scale, we can grow things on 1 square metre in pots or whatever. We can do it in a courtyard in 10 square metres. At the suburban scale, we can do it on 100 square metres and maybe up to 1,000 square metres. And then we can see commercial horticulture at this 1 to 10, broadacre cropping at 10 to 100, open grazing land at 100 to 1,000, and then rangeland forestry 1,000 hectares to 10,000. That's a huge range of scale of some sort of land management or production. And what we find is that at either end of that scale, soil is not so important. When it gets down to containers, you can make soil mixes. You can modify the soil qualities quite dramatically at the small scale. But in this middle scale of suburban through to commercial horticulture, soil is really, really important in the potential. Whereas when we look at rain and water, down at this small scale, tiny amounts of water are required, relatively speaking, and they're often readily available from roof runoff, town supply, whatever. Out at this other end, rainfall is everything. You don't get broadacre farmers saying, oh, what's the sunshine levels? How many lumens per square foot do you get in your farming country? They say, what's your rainfall? At least that's what they do in Australia. Whereas, again, at this small scale, how much rain you get is pretty important. And then when we look at sunshine, down, if you're on a balcony garden, that's facing the sun in a mid-latitude climate, or you're on the shady side of the apartment tower, huge differences. If you've got a small courtyard garden, big shadowing trees can be the main factor that's limiting what you can do. So I see this suburban scale as being a sweet point where these three factors that are both limiting and potential drivers of production are pretty much balanced. And I think that is something fairly unique about that. Okay, so just one of the case studies in the RetroSuburbia book, the Plummery, 271 square metre block, 115 square metres of garden. This is an early photo. Well, maybe it was about 2016, I think. And there's Kat Lavers, who's a permaculture educator and runs one of the sort of council-based programs for encouraging people to grow food in their gardens. as well as being the backyard experimenter, and her data of what she's produced there. This future potential, she's now reached that of 0.5 ton of food from that place, providing a fairly diverse diet and obviously lots of exchange.
What's the increment of 130 divide? Is that money or is that weight?
Just what was that?
What's the increment that she's measuring? Is it money or is it weight that she's measuring?
That's weight of let me. So that's the total in kilos in those years, and you can see the rising production there. And in 2016, this was her estimate of what the place could sort of, level out at, somewhere around 500 kilos of food, and she expected about half of that to be in veggies. And you can see those other productions, and her recent figures from 2020, I think, have reached this. I think a few years in a row now. Maybe it was 2019 she achieved that. Okay, I wasn't going to talk about animals much, but just to recognise that animals are an important part of the system. And I love this little guinea pig house in movable lawnmowers, of course. Because of the focus on drylands, I wanted to talk about something that might be a bit controversial for some people involved in permaculture when we're looking at small garden farming systems. There's a really important balancing act between balancing biomass, food and living space. And we've characterised how to grow perennial food from tree crops in these backyard systems through 3 different systems. The first I call backyard orchards, which is a more traditional thing of single wide space trees, often with grass underneath, where kids might play and whatever, might be herbaceous mixed ground cover, but it's basically tree system, fairly robust and wide space. And then over here, the edible forest gardens, much more higher density, multi-layers idea that's been very strongly adopted, through permaculture. And, a lot of people would say that's what a permaculture garden actually is. Of course, this model historically comes from the subtropics and the tropics, but of course, temperate climate models, have been adapted. And we can see that there's more woody biomass in this because there's more density, and there's also often more diversity, but there's often less useful space for humans to move around, though this may be better as a habitat for poultry, although they can also work in this sort of space. And then down the bottom here, this intensive fruit gardens, this is more espaliers, small multi-graft fruit trees, really focusing on what are the things that are going to produce the most food for the least space. And this becomes more critical as you've got less and less space, like Cat Labor's place in the plummery. And it's also reflecting a nutritional balance of the learnings of some permies over the decades, including ourselves, that, while it's great to produce fruit, actually in the diet we probably need to eat more veggies than fruit. So what this is showing that these intensive fruit gardens are in the middle between this low density, wide spacing backyard orchard systems and this very close high density. And then in terms of yield, total yield of food and diversity of food, the edible forest gardens, I mostly think, are halfway between this intensive fruit garden system and the more traditional backyard orchards. And then in terms of woody biomass, the stuff we actually can't eat as humans, but, provide the structural framework, that the backyard orchards are halfway between this low woody biomass intensive fruit gardens and this high woody biomass edible forest gardens. So they all have their strengths and weaknesses, but this area we've got and the dryness of climate or how much water we have available is a key factor. So if we've got very little, secure water in a dryland environment or not enormous groundwater reserves and limited space, this intensive fruit garden strategy is probably the best one. If we've got, deep, good groundwater reserves, but we want multi-use space for kids to play or whatever, this more traditional backyard orchards makes a lot of sense. And if we've got more space and more rainfall or secure water, then packing more things in together makes a lot of sense. Hopefully those options help clarify some of the issues relating to woody biomass. The other one is how we contain excess growth of trees, and use this example of a vigorous fig or mulberry, lift pruning, pollarding, even stem girdling, root pruning, and of course strategies like wicking beds that are separate from the competition of roots, and also trenches filled with wood chips replaced periodically to reduce this massive root competition that can happen in small gardens. So just recognising that there's, can be limits to trees, especially in our ability to produce important vegetable crops. And recognising that urban forests can be both an obstacle and an asset, and especially if we're in drier climates or cooler climates where we need, especially the winter sun, evergreen trees such as eucalypts or conifers can be particularly problematic. And that in relation to a lot of the leafy suburbs, creative, respectful reuse might be often the best example. This is the Abdallah House case study of Richard Telford. This tree all of the wood was reused in the retrofit of the house. I want to just briefly mention some of the strategies beyond the boundaries, because there is, of course, a big role for trees in suburban areas, but it's often on the public land. And recognising that places that carry storm water, the outflows need to be able to cope with those huge surges of water that exceed the capacity of the suburban private blocks to absorb. So stormwater engineering is an incredibly important part, but we don't want the plumage drainage model of just exporting all the water away. We want to catch it, spread it, soak it in. In our own environment, we've documented this and this involvement of managing Spring Creek, which is downstream of us, as a novel ecosystem absorbing and cleaning storm water. And another strategy that I want to mention that's sort of touched on in RetroSuburbia, not as the main focus of the book, but what are the possibilities in the bigger urban industrial landscapes and the peri-urban landscapes, of just recognising that some of these giant warehouses that exist are huge opportunities to collect stormwater. And this conceptual design of food production completely running off roof collection and yet not having gigantic investment in tank storage. So this situation where you've got 10,000 square metres of warehouse roof, even with summer rain of only 300 millimetres, that's 3 megalitres of water. But to store 3 megalitres of water in tanks is incredibly expensive. So instead of that, these two 50,000 litre tanks at the edge of the warehouse, maybe a shipping container and a little strip of reliably irrigated, drip irrigated veggies that might be 1,000 square metres, some trellised crops, and then out here the surplus water goes through these swale drains and with these blocking sandbags to furrow irrigate crops. Now, in the driest years, all you might do is maybe these corn, bean and pumpkins, and maybe 4,000 square metres. But as you go out in a good summer, you might get to be growing broader crops and you might be doing chooks or rotational pigs as it's possible to do. Otherwise, this is just sort of dry land environment. So it's sort of opportunistic use of the water when it's available and accepting that in some dry years you cut back and just stick to your really reliable system. So that, is effectively a 2 hectare urban market garden running off waste water. So these possibilities of combining things on land that is open and available that may be leased. But this wasn't our sort of primary focus with RetroSuburbia, but recognising there are these opportunities for people to scale up from where they live and take advantage of the areas where they are. Okay, just wanted to briefly touch on larger households as a key part of RetroSuburbia and seeing how some of these strategies for ownership and living arrangements might work for different people. So the extended family household, the household landlord who takes in renters, or the neighbourhood landlord who buys neighbouring houses, the people who have volunteer and hosts, and these strategies over here like relocation from cities to country town, shared ownership between families, such as that previous family I showed, co-housing retrofit of existing buildings into some sort of community, and also the strategy of just people buying houses next to each other and creating those sort of spaces, and other strategies that fit into these other two responses. So just point people to the RetroSuburbia website where there's a lot more case studies than the ones in the book, and some of the other resources that are there. Okay.
So we started a half hour late. We're going to go 4 to 5:30, so we have to leave at 6. So we have we've gone 45 minutes of the hour and a half here, David. So just time.
Yeah. So happy to take questions. if that suits there.
Maybe to show a hand. Is there anybody? Show hands. Questions are going to be. Yeah. Okay.
More than that today.
Or comments also. If you've got any comments, happy to. Hello.
Hi, David. So I'm a nature connection and permaculture mentor for children. And I got a question from a 9-year-old girl recently, and I'm sure she would love to hear how you would answer this question. So I'll share it with her and others. But her question was really heavy, and it was, my name's Birdie, and she's a teacher. Birdie, do you think that the world will be a habitable place for humans within my lifetime? I'm wondering what you might have to say.
Yeah, I think there's definitely will be, but the road along the way could be very rocky and harsh in some ways, but I think there's always possibilities, and through adversity comes new strength, and also comes the new savouring and valuing of things that are possible. And I think for many people, for example, just the stresses that have happened with the pandemic and the lockdowns have people incredibly valuing personal connection to people again, because, not having it for a while. So I suppose a lot of spiritual traditions certainly teach that idea of transformation coming through, using the biblical words, walking through the valley of death sort of idea. And so a lot of learning we can see in our own lives has come through crises. So I think also seeing the abundance and power of nature to surge back and adapt to all of, some of the worst destructions that humans have wrought, at least on a local scale, always gives me hope. So those places we work along our local creek, which is a beautiful novel ecology. The gold miners in the 19th century washed all the soil out of that valley, sluiced it back to bare rock. No one did anything to rehabilitate it, and nature has done all of that. And of course, nature uses tougher and tougher plants as the conditions get worse and worse. So even if, there are many, many things that are lost, and great tragedy and loss of biodiversity, nature does spring back with at least her own answers, and our path is to find out how to work with that and live lightly and work out, there's an excess of this plant or an excess of this animal. How can we creatively provide for our own needs by being smart enough to make use of what nature has too much of? And so that's our, always, I think, our creative opportunity and role.
Thank you so much, David.
Great.
Wow. Hi, David.
Hi.
It's an honor to meet you. My name's Arrow. My question is, I come from the suburbs, and it's something like, what, in your experience, could you offer in regards to some wisdom of interpersonal skills to kind of talk to more cantankerous family members and old friends and, folks who are very foreign to permaculture but want to live.
And just for context, is that in the household or sort of like in family networks and or neighbourhood or what? Because they're really important questions, but I was just wondering where your particular sort of focus is there, or are you thinking of it just generally?
I'm thinking particularly about my dad who lives in the suburbs of a densely populated city. And he's got a beautiful opportunity to grow a lot of food and transform his area, his yard. And he has a lot of connections there, but he just mows his lawn.
Yeah. Look, I think there's always the starting with where people are at and what they're passionate about. So, like if I was talking to, just say, for example, might not be your dad at all, but an old cantankerous, maybe retired engineer of my generation who sort of tinkers with his vintage car in the workshop, I'd be talking to him about his skills and how valuable they are in terms of being able to fix things and, doing that as a sort of, in some way, part of the non-monetary community economy. Rather than judging him, there he is with his, huge V8 fossil fuel burner that he pours all this money into, and critiquing that. So that's at two levels. Firstly, stepping back from the surface dysfunction or sort of judgment of what that person's doing and saying, what's the potential in what they have? And then the other issue of saying, oh, well, there's this other potential that maybe someone else could do, this food growing potential, for example, of, well, if that's not for you, there might be a renter down the street who hasn't, is in a place that they want to garden and they've got giant trees and they've reached the limits of their garden, and you could offer them, a bit of, just for some limited trial, some of your backyard to do something rather than you need to do this thing. And then, of course, there's just generally the thing of, that we be our own guinea pigs and be our own example of what we're on about, which is, of course, a slower process and sometimes more frustrating than, you should do sort of idea. So it's obviously, that delicate balance, and it's most delicate within families, and especially with, this whole potential between older owners and adult children, this enormous potential for stronger reconsolidated households, but these huge processes of relearning relationships that don't fall back into past ones. So, and sometimes that works by younger people connecting with older people of their parents' generation where they don't have those blocks. And yet we can see how some of those can come around full circle and enable better connection within families as well. But yeah, it's big issues and really important stuff.
Hello, David. My name's Howard. Really a pleasure to meet you in person. And I appreciate the questions of my fellow colleagues here that are very philosophical. But I have a very basic question on one of your slides. And the slide I'm thinking about is where you're girdling a tree, and it doesn't look like the girdle goes all the way around. And I'm questioning why you chose those two portions of the tree to girdle.
Well, that's just a conceptual thing. Stem girdling was cutting the bark out to slow down the growth of tree. I mean, depending on
slow down the growth, but not to kill it all.
Yes. Sorry, I didn't explain that. That with very vigorous trees, obviously this thing of ring barking or girdling is, sort of at its extreme kills the tree. But if you just take the bark off a very vigorous tree or part of it, often you do it in two overlapping pieces, so you're not completely cutting off the sap. But it is extraordinary with very vigorous trees, even if you go right round and removing the bark, the tree actually just slows down a bit and then grows over it again. But it's an alternative to the logic that people often think of as cutting the top of the tree. And although that pollarding works, sometimes it just stimulates the tree to grow even stronger. So you get this woody cycle growth where the tree is growing lots of wood, and every few years you're chopping it back and slowing the tree down by either cutting roots or stem girdling is actually sometimes a better strategy.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to be able to use that technique.
Right.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us. My name is Jonathan, and we are having catastrophic wildfires, and Australia is having catastrophic bushfires. And I'm wondering if there were a few skills that you would recommend for communities to develop around resilience and restoration following a bushfire.
Yeah, well, that's something, if we've got time, can go into more. I think there's two aspects, I suppose. The resilience to bushfires in residential areas is a lot to do with the presence of able-bodied people defending houses when a fire comes through. Because what we know is the presence of, in Australia from repeated research, that the presence of one able-bodied person is more significant than any other site factor or feature of the house in determining whether a house burns down or not. And I'm not talking about a professional firefighter, just the presence of one able-bodied person. Because almost all houses burn down after the fire front has passed. And obviously there's issues around, what is a more safe or more defendable space, and we investigated all of that in this case study, bushfire design case study that we did back in 1983 following the Great Fires here, and that we republished this after the 2009 fires because we still thought it was really relevant. Our local authorities have gone a little bit more the paternalistic route towards, like in the US, of evacuate everyone. And we know in the long term, in a future, low energy future, that macro top-down, massive resource control, command and control won't work. So the presence of people actually going through a fire, although that can be incredibly traumatic, that also bonds the people who were in that space, whereas the people who were removed often become very alienated from the community, completely disempowered, and unable to get back afterwards. So they miss all that amazing community bonding that happens. Now, of course, these are very personal choices about whether people are prepared to face those traumas, but a lot of people don't understand that if they leave, the authorities might not let them back for days, weeks, and they might not know what has happened at their place. So understanding the psychological processes that are very important to whether places can be defended, and the sort of social bonding and the bottom-up resilience, so that we're not 100% dependent on the centralised state professional systems. In an ideal world, we would have both. Like the Swiss approach, everyone's ready to defend the country, but they have all this sort of professional stuff too. That would be ideal, but it doesn't seem we have that world. We have this top-down model and no capacity at the community level, and then at some point that top-down model will fail or abandon people because it can't cope, and that the focus will be on only defending, larger cities or whatever. So that autonomy and self-reliance, and we find that there's also, although that works best at a household level, it can work at a neighbourhood level where people can say, well, you as a single mum down the street, if you want to come and be part of our defence team to just, come down the street 400 metres, that's a sort of safe thing to do late in a situation by prior arrangement, and is an alternative between this very difficult paradigm where we should leave early or stay and defend, but never leave late, because that is the worst strategy of all. And the larger fires are, in Australia, we say leaving early means leaving the night before or early in the morning before a bad blow-up day in drought conditions when the authorities are predicting extremely difficult. Not when, the flames are coming over the hill. So that is like very deep learning and repeated experience, which the science is still saying that, but here the authorities have tended to pull back from the stay and defend because of the legalistic, risk management sort of strategy. But yeah, in terms of the recovery from fire, and when we look at that, we can look at it at a domestic scale, but also at a landscape scale. We do need to have a lot of faith in nature's ability in fire ecologies to recover. But there obviously are things that can be done, to assist that as well. And, one of the most important things is when we have regenerative cycles, that the more palatable trees, like in North America, the deciduous species as opposed to the conifers, that we want to keep livestock off those areas when those delicate regeneration processes are happening, even if when they are more established, livestock grazing through those and opening up those environments would be the very best thing for them. So there are things like that where intervention and non-intervention can be incredibly important in how things, regenerate. But yeah, I think people are often assumed that, that's the end of everything is dead. And of course, both in North America and in Australia, there is, this huge resilience in the ecologies. Okay. And should we jump into talking further about fire?
Let's do one more question, and then we'll go on to the fire ecology more.
Yep.
Hey, David. So, a lot of the suburbs here in the U.S., I imagine, are pretty similar in Australia, in that they're really under the control of HOAs and cities and municipalities and zoning rules. And a lot of your great ideas at the current moment, with the way things are written, wouldn't be allowed to be adopted. Do you have any type of examples or case studies or advice on how you have gotten maybe some communities, suburb regions in Australia to adopt these to help sort of stop those?
Yeah, well, the one I mentioned before of Verge Gardens, especially in my home state of Western Australia, have become almost universal, and councils actually have guidelines, that consider, traffic visibility and stuff about what you can plant, on your verges. But the way that came about was people just doing it illegally. That's how it came about. It didn't come about because, this idea, let's sort of, let's write a policy to, encourage this. So, and I think that has application to lots and lots of things like backyard compost toilet systems. Don't ask the authorities because they don't have a framework that can approve that. So their answer has got to be no. But what I've always said in my presentations, and this is, in presentations where councils are funding me to do these, telling people not to ask for permission, but to make sure they have the social license. Now, the social license can be sometimes harder to get than the legal license because it's about being in communication with neighbours and people who are potentially adversely affected or might get narky about something you're doing. And that's mostly the immediate neighbours. So that's an imperative that we need anyway, because those are the main reporters to council. Because when we look at development processes, clearly when new houses are being built and major changes are being made on a private piece of land, there's a development approval process, and the council, the authorities look very clearly at that. And then when it's done, it's sort of often not a revisiting of that. And then they're relying on the squeaky wheels or the complaints or whatever to trigger some sort of interventions. And so that's the great thing about retrofitting, and small changes can often happen under the radar if they're not the sort of things that can be approved. And then when we have many, many examples, it's then people like ourselves who are prepared to stand up and actually say, yeah, we do these things, and navigate that ambiguous relationship with authority to get that sort of progressive acceptance. So there is obviously, when you're going to do something that's illegal or not approvable, you need to be fairly clear about, okay, who could be adversely affected by what I do? And think that through before any of those people are even potentially adversely affected. And you need to be in communication with them. And so obviously, prior arrangements where you're exchanging this for what they're doing for you give you more license, that social license that people often talk about that corporations need. Well, householders need it too from each other. And it's not necessarily any easier than, in some situations, the legal license is, because you're dealing with people's emotional stuff and history and whatever.
Great, thank you.
Right.
All right. So I believe you had another presentation prepared. And we have a little time left here. You maybe go into the bushfires more. Are you ready for that?
Yeah. Let me see. Just find where it is.
So we are scheduled to be in dinner in 15 minutes. We could tell the cook that he doesn't like last minute changes anyway. But if we want to go a little longer and he gives permission, are you
Yep.
game a little bit more?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe. So Chris, maybe you want to check in. Okay. Oh, and maybe another 15. Yeah, we don't want to keep it too long. So it doesn't get too dark. But while you're looking for that, David, I'm going to throw another question at you. How permaculture, of course, got started in Australia. It was on BBC, ABC television. How is permaculture acceptance going in general in Australia these days? Is it pretty widely known, accepted, or are you still facing is there a lot of obstacles, or how is it going?
You might say it's still pretty fringe, but at the level of understanding it as a cool form of gardening or sort of deeper sustainable living, that has been very widely promoted through especially gardening programs on our public broadcaster, and of course Australia, that public broadcaster is a much stronger mainstream media role than exists in the US. So you have people like Josh Byrne, like these personality characters that everyone knows, and the most extraordinary of them now, Costa Giorgiades, who wrote the foreword to RetroSuburbia and has got his new book out, with illustrations by Brenna Quinlan, and has got pages in his book for absolutely mainstream Australia about permaculture. And he's probably the most known, recognisable character in Australia. Like walking down the street with him, you just can't get anywhere. Everyone wants a selfie with Costa. So these people are, incredibly high celebrities, and they are, they're permies. But, I wouldn't want to overstate how much that then is recognised in terms of sort of official, mainstream, serious sustainability. That there's been that, yes, it's found that sort of niche in popular culture and a sort of a background agent of influence in what we would broadly call sustainability. But, most permaculture is still happening like it is in the US through small self-employed and small business, entrepreneurial and community-based and household-based things. There are some job descriptions where, having a background in permaculture is actually a tick. Various, community garden coordinators and school gardening sort of programs and stuff like that. So it's definitely a much deeper penetration into mainstream society than perhaps in the US, but it's still out there on the fringes to a degree.
Well, I was always hoping. But we are living in a very fire-prone landscape here too, David, where we're doing our course. And, of course, much of the drylands, some drylands get so dry there's nothing to carry fire, but most of our drylands are still can burn. So curious to hear what you have to say.
Okay. let me see how to just get this shared.
Okay, we see something.
Okay. So you can see that Sue and a friend of ours and her daughter photo I took back in 1993 following the Great Ash Wednesday fires in Victoria, which stimulated the Fly Away House book that I mentioned. And also, I think, emblematic of the hope of rebirth, regrowth that you can see in the foreground there, the Xanthorrhea, one of our native fire-adapted understory plants, springing back to life, and the early stages of the shooting, epicormic shooting of these eucalypts. So this was a photo taken in the early months of winter following those catastrophic fires in the autumn. This sort of subject presentation, Bushfire Resilient Design for Land and Climate Care, is the subject of a quite long essay that you can find on the newly revamped Holmgren Design website. If I had it organised, I could put a link into that, but you can find it there under that title, and was a presentation I gave to the Australian Permaculture Convergence in Brisbane earlier this year. So, of course, the huge recent fires were at an enormous scale, didn't affect our region, but sort of really changed the scale of impact, and especially into urban areas. And I was also very struck by the reinforcement of two simplistic messages that finally people from an environmental perspective thought, this is climate change and, we need to act in the climate emergency. And amongst a lot of people in rural Australia who, from their own perspectives, over decades, it's the lack of land management stupid. And these two arguments running backwards and forwards, when in fact there's truth in both these, and the idea that could we bring the truths in both of these arguments together in a sort of a unified, not a compromise, yes, we need to do a bit of this and a bit of that. No, actually through the way we manage land, could we be also directly addressing the climate problem? And so my personal response was this very extensive essay. There's Meliadora in Hepburn, I think one of the most fire-prone towns in Victoria, and Victoria is the heart of the most fire-prone region in the world. So we took fire very, very seriously when we came, even though we're part of the town. And at that time in the mid-80s, there was not much sense of hazard for towns. But just going back to the beginning, when I met Bill Mollison 1 year before I took this photo of him on a plant collecting expedition in Tasmania, we were living in the house that he had saved from the great 1967 Hobart fires that killed 62 people, injured 900 and left 7,000 homeless. And the stories from that were sort of not only galvanised and provided a focus for my own work over the decades, But we built into the ideas expressed in Permaculture One, which is, by the way, is now back available as a downloadable ebook. Meliodora Publishing has got that available again, where design against natural disaster in whatever form is appropriate in different regions of the world is an inherent and universal part of permaculture design. And of course, for us in that region, that's what it was. And in RetroSuburbia, we set that, within a context of a more generalized summary of natural disasters, of understanding where you are and what are those potentials. And to recognize that houses are both the prime assets and refuges for fire. This is, of course, our place at Meliodora, designed as a bushfire-resistant house, and, that is actually very compatible with passive solar design. So, obviously that helps in giving us confidence to consider that house as a refuge. And recognising that irrigated food gardens as a fire-resistant buffer is incredibly important. It reinforces the defence of the house and also of the economic resilience of the household following fires, and really should be established around each house. And houses should be sited where productive food gardens are possible. And so if we say, but we're going to build on a rocky ridge in the middle of a dense conifer or eucalypt forest, maybe we should be thinking about whether that is the right place to live, not just for its fire hazard reasons, but also can food be sort of grown there. Obviously, on the larger scale, the larger landscapes around are also important, but they're not as important as that immediate inner zone landscape. So there's Meliodora, here's Hepburn, and unlike a lot of rural towns surrounded by farmland, we're surrounded by forest and deep, steep, dissected country that is hard for firefighters to access. So using the permaculture zoning idea, and we think of a homestead or house and fully irrigated gardens as zone 1, orchards as zone 2, commercial crops, and then managed rangelands and forests out here. What we've often got is that these zones are completely missing. There might be a house and a little garden, but out beyond that those zones don't exist. We're straight into rangeland and forests, and that often these are completely unmanaged in the modern era. So this is especially so in current urban fringe and small settlement landscapes. The productive and more fire-safe horticultural and agricultural zones are missing, and the historically managed wild forests and woodlands have now become thicket forests. And if the bush is managed, it's often only managed to remove non-native species. So this management might be in line with the prevailing orthodoxy of nativism, but it also has its origins in the legal fiction in the Australian context of terra nullius, that this was an empty land and that allowed the British to claim Australia without reference to Indigenous peoples. Whereas, in fact, Indigenous peoples managed all those landscapes, of course, both here and in North America. So the strategic focus on the urban bushland interface and small vulnerable settlements is really important to empower landholders and communities to actively manage their neighbourhood for current and future benefits, and employ a wider range of labour and skill-intensive management options to reduce fuel, but also rearrange it and accelerate the decomposition of fuels, rehydrate landscapes and enhance biodiversity, and enhance forest maturation towards more open, amenable and fire-safe woodland structure that's better able to survive a drying climate, and then use the surplus forest biomass to create a circular local economy of renewable dispatchable energy and soil enhancing biochar. So that's what my essay is focused on doing. Some of the building blocks of that, of course, we had the oldest continuously managed cultural landscapes in the world, managed with fire, and in a landscape that's intrinsically adapted to fire. But our modern forests are mostly dense, and fuel reduction burning is the most default management tool, and it's usually too hot, too damaging. You can see my sour face there standing in this area that's been cooked too hot in a fuel reduction burn. And then you get close to settlements, there's smoke problems, there's risks to private property, and that's driven forest managers to meet their quotas to burn forest by doing much more of it remote from settlements and in ways that contradict ecological and cultural burning practices. So, this is sort of typical pattern of fire that's too hot, and you get all of these problems and lots of this dense epicormic shoot. Of course, in most conifer forests, you don't get that. You just kill all the standing trees, except perhaps some of the largest ones, and you get a whole lot more standing dry fuel. This is what sort of sensible burning, what is often called cultural burning, here looks like. It doesn't burn the organic matter in the soil and doesn't damage the plants. There's also, of course, options to rearrange fuels, both with mechanical equipment, but also by hand. And this rearrangement of fuel, rather than getting rid of it, has a huge effect. When fuels are laddered up in the vegetation, they're arranged often to burn. When we can get them compacted down, not only do we accelerate decomposition, but just the rearrangement itself reduces the intensity of fire. Just think of how the crumpled pages of paper burn so intensely, whereas a book in a fire is actually burns completely differently. Also, greater use of grazing animals to consume and trample fuels in farming systems that use native pasture species, fire retardant shelter belts, and silvopastoral systems to build soil, water, and nutrient holding capacity. That's our goats down on the public land eating the blackberries. And of course, the blackberries are actually fire retardant plants, but the dry canes that in our climate accumulate under the blackberries are very, very flammable. So just trampling and breaking those down accelerates decomposition. We've also got earthworks to rehydrate landscapes. And of course that can be on a large scale, sort of key line in pastoral farming catchments, natural sequence farming on floodplains, especially along watercourses receiving urban storm water. And soil amendments to accelerate decomposition, biochar, fungal inoculants, and just recognising that in low fertility environments, the addition of key missing minerals, especially calcium and phosphate, do accelerate the decomposition of what would otherwise be fuels. And to protect and extend fire retardant ecosystems. Now, in other parts of the world, even in Australia, up the east coast, that might be native rainforest vegetation systems. In our areas, it's mostly novel ecosystems of deciduous species, such as we have along Spring Creek. And then thinning regrowth of native forests. And this applies, I believe, in dense regrowth North American conifer forests, as well as it does in our eucalypt hardwood forests. Reduces the intensity of bushfires, enhances the resilience to a drying climate, and improves future ecological and economic values. So these are photos taken at Fryers Forest in our semi-arid forests where the trees grow slowly and produce very dense wood, thinning that wood for firewood, but also structural fence post and other timbers. There's been very little of this happen in Australia in recent times because everyone makes everything out of concrete and steel, and there's not so many what we call greenies with chainsaws. That most people think the best thing for nature is to not touch it. So creating new livelihoods in ecological forestry from green-collar jobs where we can do this work, not necessarily where it makes complete economic sense to be a profitable operation, but we can do this where we combine the social and fire safety values from it with also creating new livelihoods. And I've actually used a North American technology here. Our son Oliver Holmgren has suggested that this is some of the oil power labs in Berkeley, California have got some of the most advanced new technology in wood gasification. And I've added my tick here to using woody biomass for fuel. I gave a cross against using acorns and using grain. Although, from an economically rational point of view, there's parts of the world where there's so much grain and it's so cheap that people actually use it as fuel in these furnaces. It doesn't make sense from a permaculture, deeper sustainability point of view, but we certainly in most places, anywhere where there's even moderate levels of rainfall, woody biomass is an enormous abundance of nature. And of course, out of that can come electricity, heat, and of course, biochar as a byproduct. Just briefly, this was a fire that we faced a few years ago on the escarpment above us, and our Spring Creek corridor forest of deciduous trees, mostly wild, that we've been involved in protecting from nativist reduction and removal and replacement with more eucalypts, did actually contribute to the fire stopping. And, we need to celebrate our stories of resilient nature. This is the Burnhole Arboretum. These are, of course, Californian redwoods from your side of the Pacific. And, of course, they are another fire-adapted tree. But all of this grove was protected, partly a combination of the power of the state, water bomber services, partly from the work we've done over 30 years, and partly from good luck that the weather wasn't so bad. But we also know that if fire had raged through the Burnhole Arboretum, the redwoods would have resprouted. So also to celebrate those stories of resilient people in communities, people who have been bushfire survivors and who defended their properties, and people who helped re-establish properties that following fire. just to mention two resources, obviously RetroSuburbia. There's also the extract from the book that's available as a free download, the Bushfire Resilient extract that we did made as a free download following the fire. So they're all pages from that free download. And I already mentioned a Flywire House, but I want to mention Joan Webster's work, both her big complete bushfire safety book, but there's essential bushfire safety tips, which we have here, and another writing I did, Bushfire Resilient Landscapes and Communities, back in 2009. But this book I wanted to particularly make mention of because Joan Webster is the foremost bushfire educator in this country, received awards for her work. She was the journalist who, back in 1964, working with CSIRO government scientists as a journalist, how to communicate the essence of the message, stay and defend or leave early. And that was her in 1964. She's now 92 and lives locally. And CSIRO Publishing, the government publishing house, which published this book, decided not to reprint it. Not because it wasn't selling, it's a fantastic book, but because her work is now not exactly in line with the government official position, because she still encourages people to safely shelter and stay and defend in appropriate situations. And so they declined to continue to publish her book. So Meliodora Publishing has just taken this on, and we are reprinting this book. Of course, at the moment, it's in Australia, but we would really like to get this shipped to the US through our partners in Permaculture Principles and their fulfillment service with John Wage's Permaculture Design Mag, where our books can get out, because, of course, we totally boycott Amazon and our books are not available on Amazon. So part of our move is to sort of try and maybe we can bring some of this Australian knowledge that's so relevant, especially to the Western US and Canada. So I thought I'd end on that little partially commercial promo, but partially a passion for the support for this incredibly eminent Australian who is still as sharp as ever. And it's pretty fearsome as publishers dealing with Joan Webster. She is amazing.
All right. Thank you very much, David.
Okay.
I'd be happy to be a distributor in my region here. I'll have to talk to John Wages about that maybe. Or I used to import water for every farm I used to buy boxes and boxes of those back in the day.
Yep. Yeah, a great classic book.
Well,
okay. I realise, we've run over time, and apologies again for being late and for your dinner. I can take questions, but I'm sure I don't know how the time's going. Probably.
Yeah, we must part because of our schedule here, but
yep.
What's that? Okay, we have one more here, and then but it's been lovely, David, once again.
Mr. Holmgren, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I've had this weighing question. I don't know totally how to phrase it without giving backstory and all that, but I'm from San Jose, California, which is the 6th largest city in the United States. And it doesn't seem like a great place to be. and I'm pulled up north to kind of greener pastures, and would love to something like start a small community or something like that, and restoration work up here. And I'm very troubled within on, you use the word migration, and if I am to stay and defend the drying thing, or kind of build a lifeboat of sorts in the forest somewhere. And I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I suppose for me, RetroSuburbia distilled a lot of the learnings from 40 years of the Back to the Land movement, both in our country and your country and other places, and finding this balance of between all of these factors is very much a personal thing. It depends on context, age, skills, health, fitness, and we tried to map a lot of those strategies in RetroSuburbia, and just recognise that, you know, different pathways will suit people, you know, at different times, and both those rational tools like the real estate assessment tool can sort of help clarify some of those things, but also understanding that in terms of personal life journey, partners, family connections, and recognising that there is a huge opportunities for people to go out when they're young and sort of do bold and different things, and then often as they get older, or even when they, you know, have children, that connection to community and, you know, connection to family can be important, and there's those ruptures or separations which may turn out to be actually permanent through all sorts of circumstances. So just understanding this huge number of factors, and to try and look at different stories and experience and put the toe in the water of different things. And that's the great thing about volunteering, of actually going and throwing oneself into something rather than trying to make all of these decisions up front, and experience different things, and so discover what is really aligns exactly with what you want and need, and what doesn't, you know, through those processes. And I think that's been one of the great learning experiences of, you know, last years, not just for young people, but people of different ages as well. Okay, a big question. Sorry, the answer was not straightforward.
Okay, come on, we got one more question.
Okay.
Hi, David. Thank you so much. I live here in Eastern Washington, really close to a reservation, and the fires have just been really, really insane, you know, over the last couple years. And I'm wondering if you guys have any sort of like trauma response, or just like community coming together and responding and replanting, and what that kind of looks like, if there is anything in place like that.
Yeah, look, I think the main focus in Australia with restoration has been of people's own environment, because in southern Australia, at least, there's been quite strong understandings in the community about the resilience of fire ecologies to recover. But in places like in northern New South Wales, in some of the prime subtropical rainforests that have never burnt before, there was quite a lot of direct action to protect those areas spontaneously by people organising, because the government didn't consider them as prime strategic assets. And then there's also been work of communities coming together to look at how they can rehabilitate some of those areas of these iconic ancient rainforests, including forests that people of my generation, when they were young, fought to defend from logging and other impacts. So there's a range, but in most places in Australia, it's the trauma of what's hit communities and bringing those back together. And it's the work of my colleague Daryl Taylor, and in combination with other American colleagues too, in the Facing Fire network that's been in mostly people in California, but also other regions, talking about and looking at what are the strategies also for communities not to succumb to the command and control of the helping professions that smother communities often after fire.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was excellent. It's been such a great, wonderful couple sessions. Thanks so much for your generosity and sharing with us. And I can see the energy here. Everybody's stoked. Are you guys stoked? Yeah.
Great to connect, and we'll try and be more on time with any future.
Yeah. Well, that's the time. It always gets this edgy.
Hey, Sue. Hey, we'll ask you again. Bye.
Hey, Skeeter!
Yeah. Woo! Hugs. Yeah.
Fairies.
Yeah, they're still here.
Yeah. And so are we, fortunately.
Yeah.
Still here.
What a great ride it's been. Yeah, sirree. Yeah. I'm looking forward. I want to do this on an online course sometime and invite the whole world. So we'll invite you too. Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Penny.
Hey, Sue. It's good to see you.
Okay, we better let you go to dinner, a later dinner.
Okay, well, it's nice to see you. It's great that Sue stuck her face in there. Yeah. Sorry, but you do all the work, right?
If only. It's nice that people think that.
Okay. All right, well, that's a love.
Okay.
Lots of love to you guys.
Bye.